Hi, I'm Stephanie Gilmore, Curator of Collections here at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, as part of our Small Wonders video program, we're going to look at our Passenger Car Drumhead collection. So what is a drumhead exactly? When it comes to railroading, we're not talking about the instrument, but rather the illuminated sign that adorned the rear of a passenger train. They gained the name drumhead because they were often round and hollow like a drum. While some came in different shapes, such as squares and rectangles, they were typically round. Very rarely they had other unique shapes, like in the case of the Pennsylvania Railroad's shield design. A detailed history of railroad drumheads is not well known. However, we know that they gained popularity after trains had electricity on board their passenger cars. As far as we know, the first drumhead was displayed on the Northern Pacific's North Coast Limited around 1900. The North Coast Limited traveled between Chicago and the Pacific Northwest. Prior to 1971, when Amtrak began to operate America's passenger trains, individual rail companies offered their own passenger services. There was a lot of competition between railroads. The most prominent passenger trains, which often had special names, were heavily promoted by each railroad company. One device used to advertise and identify these trains was the drumhead, also known as a tail sign. Drumheads were powerful advertising tools. People, including Hollywood celebrities, often posed and had pictures taken near them. Those pictures promoted that particular train as a celebrity's favorite train, which was a great endorsement of its service. One of the most popular trains for celebrities in the 20th century was the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe's Super Chief, which ran from Chicago to Los Angeles between 1936 and 1971. Celebrities like Janet Leigh, Bing Crosby, James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Judy Garland, Richard Burton, and Elizabeth Taylor rode the Chief. It was known for its top-notch dining and lounge cars, which by 1951 included the famous turquoise room that could be reserved for private parties of up to 12 guests. The Colorado Railroad Museum's Navajo observation car happens to be from the Super Chief and has a unique drumhead attached to its rear. We also have a second separate drumhead for the Super Chief in our collection. In the case of this image with Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, the drumhead not only advertised that the train was a Santa Fe train, but it also promoted Lucy and Desi's 1956 romantic comedy film, Forever Darling. Drumheads also served a practical purpose for identifying trains while in the station. At night, when multiple similar-looking trains were lined up on the platform, illuminated drumheads would help the passengers differentiate the trains. Another drumhead from a popular named train in our collection is for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Scenic Limited. This particular sign is one of our more detailed, with a scene from the Royal Gorge in the center. We know that this drumhead is less than 100 years old, since the Western was added to the Denver and Rio Grande name in 1923. It is quite possibly a reproduction, as it's in spectacular shape. The Scenic Limited ran from Denver to Salt Lake City from 1906 to 1946. It certainly lived up to its name as it traveled via some amazing natural wonders such as the Royal Gorge. In addition to being advertisements, drumheads were a source of pride for its employees to point out their lighted emblems as trains passed through numerous towns and crossings where the public could see them. Normally only made for a railroad's most important passenger trains and never used on local service or commuter trains, drumheads would always be on the last car, which was often a lounge or observation car. They were usually made to be movable so that they could be used on whatever last car made up the consist of a particular train on different days. However, as you can see from these California Zephyr photos, sometimes the signs were permanently affixed to the end of the train. This Denver Post drumhead in our collection was made for the Cheyenne Frontier Days train. Cheyenne Frontier Days is the largest annual outdoor Western and rodeo festival in the world. From 1908 to 1970, a train would run from Denver Union Station to the Cheyenne Depot in Wyoming so that train and rodeo enthusiasts alike could attend the festival. The Denver Post revived the Cheyenne Frontier Days train in 1992, and this drumhead was part of that consist, which included Amtrak locomotives and Colorado ski train coaches. While Cheyenne Frontier Days is still going, unfortunately the Denver Post ceased sponsoring the train in 2019, and another sponsor has yet to be found. This drumhead represents the Denver and Rio Grande Western between 1948 and 1967, which is when this flying logo with main line through the Rockies was used. While non-mountainous routes may have been faster, the Denver and Rio Grande Western offered a more leisurely and scenic route through the mountains, which set it apart. The flying logo suggested speed, while the mountains reminded people of how scenic the trip was. The DNRGW also had a Royal Gorge named train, for which this next drumhead was made. We don't know the exact details of this drumhead, except that it was made after the streamlined diesel debuted in the 1930s, since that is the style of train depicted within it. The Royal Gorge is over 1,000 feet deep and roughly 6 miles long. Trackage through the gorge was a contentious subject between the Santa Fe and the Rio Grande in the late 1870s as the two companies fought over who had the rights to the route. The so-called Royal Gorge War lasted from about 1878 to 1880, when the two companies ultimately settled by signing the Treaty of Boston, which gave the Rio Grande rights to the trackage through the gorge. The Rio Grande continued to run passenger trains through the gorge until 1967, when it switched to only freight service. After several company mergers and buyouts, today the independent Royal Gorge Route Railroad runs a tourist train through the gorge. This next drumhead also comes from a Denver and Rio Grande train. Known as the Prospector, it ran from Denver to Salt Lake City from 1941 to 1967. The first Prospector train was known as a DMU, or a diesel multiple unit train. This was a self-propelled, streamlined diesel-powered train with onboard engines rather than a separate locomotive. Unfortunately, due to the rough terrain it traveled and numerous technical difficulties, the diesel multiple unit Prospector only ran for 9 months from November of 1941 to July of 1942. After the end of World War II, the Rio Grande resumed the Prospector using conventional diesel locomotives to haul passengers and freight from Denver to Salt Lake City until 1967. You may be wondering why these trains all seemed to stop service in 1967. That is because by that time the government diverted mail service from trains to cars and planes, which caused a significant decrease in revenue for the railroads. With the decrease in revenue, passenger services also decreased and in some cases stopped altogether on certain routes, including the Prospector. Our next drumhead is from the Union Pacific's City of Denver train. This one is particularly special because the City of Denver was one of the first streamlined passenger trains, having debuted in June of 1936. A whole fleet of other city trains were eventually made, including Los Angeles, Portland, St. Louis, San Francisco, and Salina. The interior of the City of Denver was decorated with Western themes, sometimes even including rifles and animal head trophies. The City of Denver traveled between Chicago and Denver, offering overnight service every night. The trip took just 16 hours and ran on average about 70 miles per hour, which was quite fast for the 1930s. Last but not least, we have this Colorado Railroad Museum drumhead, which was created for the museum by Carrie Arnold. Carrie was one of the artists who helped build and paint our famous HO scale layout in the basement of the depot. This sign was used as the main museum sign from the late 1990s to about 2006. The design on the sign was also used as the official museum logo for many years. Among railroad memorabilia, drumheads are fairly rare items. Some designs only had a handful made. Additionally, as trains were removed from service, the drumheads were scrapped along with unwanted passenger cars. We are very lucky to have the ones we do here at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time when we explore more of our fascinating artifact collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.